Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, as EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas visits Serbia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia, the spotlight returns to the Western Balkans' long and bumpy road towards European Union membership. With reforms lagging and public sentiment shifting, questions loom over who will join the EU and when. Joining us today on TVP World to dissect the prospects and pressure facing the region is Toby Vogel, a co-founder of the Democratization Policy Council and a longtime analyst of EU enlargement and Balkan politics. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me.
So first of all, how realistic is it for Serbia to still claim EU membership as a strategic goal, seeing that its pace of reform is relatively slow?
Well, it makes a lot of sense for the government of President Aleksandar Vučić to claim that this is Serbia's strategic goal because he gets benefits from that claim. There has been movement in the direction of EU reforms, but there's also been backsliding on democracy on issues like freedom of the media, freedom of expression. And of course, back home, he's under a great deal of pressure from student-led protests that have been going on for many months now, and that have really chipped away at this image of him as sort of the undisputed leader. We need to see Kaja Kallas' visit in this context, against this background. The EU has always supported Vučić. It feels that he is a partner. But Vučić, meantime, is balancing that support he's getting from the European Union with his closeness, really, to the Kremlin and to Putin.
Right, so like I mentioned, Vučić is playing a very delicate balancing game here, trying to court both the European Union, but also Russia as well. So do you think this visit from Kaja Kallas is one of the purpose is to bring the Balkans back into the European fold, or what do you think the aim of her visit is?
I think that probably is the aim. The attendance by President Vučić at the Victory Day parade in Moscow on 9th of May really angered a lot of European leaders, a lot of EU leaders, and specifically Kallas, who obviously, as a former Estonian prime minister, is well aware of what Putin stands for, of what these military parades are signaling. She has no soft spot for people who are playing with this. So she went to Belgrade to deliver a, by EU standards, fairly clear message, which is that, you know, this is unacceptable. Now, the problem is that the policy, the underlying policy from the EU hasn't changed. This has not shifted the policy at all. The EU still very much looks at Vučić as a partner. It looks at Serbia as the most important country of the Western Balkans. Its entire approach to the Western Balkans is actually Belgrade-centric. So this idea of we need to keep Vučić in the fold or bring him back, as it were, is really dominating pretty much everything else.
Right. Can you help us understand what's the EU's interest in the Balkans? Why is this so important to the Union, to a point where we see Vučić repeatedly kind of cozying up to Kremlin, yet the EU is still trying to bring it into part of the Union?
That is a very good question. The issue is that the European Union has incredible leverage across the Western Balkans. It has military missions, it has rule of law missions, it has vast investments. It's by far the most important foreign direct investor in the entire region, in every single country there, and it has close political ties to all the leaders. All of whom claim that they want to join the European Union eventually. So the EU actually has a great deal of influence, but it hasn't really been using this very strategically. And so this has created the space for the likes of Vučić, and he's not the only one. I would also mention, for example, Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama, who just won an unprecedented fourth term in office. these leaders are playing on the EU's fears of quote unquote losing the region and are extracting concessions essentially. So they're trying to bring the EU to downgrade its conditionality, to downgrade the conditions it attaches to financing, to other support, and that's a game that's really been underway for a very long time.
Right, like I mentioned, there's a lot of attempt by these countries to downgrade the threshold in order to join the European Union. But the EU also emphasized that there's no shortcuts. But do you think this message will actually resonate across the region, especially with Russia competing for the interest, with EU kind of still holding them to a certain standard, with a little bit of finger wagging while Russia is saying, well, you can come join us and gain all the benefits? Are they going to lose this war when it comes to appealing to the Balkans?
Indeed. I mean, the game that you've very well described is obviously designed to extract maximum benefit with minimal concessions, with minimal reform also. Let's not forget that many of these countries, most of these countries, have seen either backsliding on democracy or have seen what experts will call, state capture, that kind of thing. So the capture of the state institutions by political parties, by individual leaders. Now, that obviously would have to come to an end should these countries actually join the European Union. This would undermine their business model of these leaders. And so they are quite comfortable in this waiting room because they can also claim that the fact that this is taking so long has led to this backsliding. So it's a way for them to deflect attention and accountability for what's going on domestically in their societies. The EU has a geopolitical interest in expansion, in enlargement into the Western Balkans. There's no doubt about that. And the geopolitical argument would obviously militate against a very tough conditionality. It would actually create momentum towards a slight softening of that. Whether this is really going to play out remains to be seen, because let's not forget that the current EU member states also need to be sold on this idea. And we have a number of countries, just to mention, for example, the Netherlands or France, that are very skeptical about enlarging the European Union at this time.
Right. Are there any countries in the region that actually has a realistic shot to be joining the European Union in the near future?
Well, Albania and Montenegro are closest in the sense of, the technical negotiations that are going on, have been going on for quite a long time. Montenegro in particular is very close to wrapping up these negotiations. There still remain hurdles, obstacles, both domestic and international. And as I mentioned, the EU itself is having second thoughts about enlargement. Not because of Montenegro or even Albania. Those are very small countries. They're quite marginal. They're not economically important. But of course, the elephant in the room is Ukraine, which also has a so-called membership prospect. And so the idea in Brussels is we need to reform internally inside the EU. Things, for example, like the common agricultural policy would collapse if Ukraine were admitted in the current system. So all of these reforms that the EU needs to undertake are another obstacle on the way to quick membership. On its own, Montenegro is not an issue. So I could see that happening within a few years, and that seems to be the goal on both sides.
Right, like you mentioned, it requires somewhat pretty monstrous reform, be it on the EU's part or on the individual countries' part, in order for a kind of seamless accession. But do you think with these things taking so long, there's still public support for joining EU across the Balkan, or do you see fatigue kicking in at some point?
I think it's maybe not fatigue about EU membership as such, but fatigue about the process, because like we said, it's been lasting for a very long time. There is no real Euroscepticism that has broad popular appeal in the Western Balkans, with the exception of Serbia, where we have seen the regime media, which is, sort of 90% of the media are on the government line, if not outright controlled by the government. they have been messaging quite relentlessly about the EU essentially being a geopolitical adversary, and we've seen similar messaging in the Bosnian Serb Republic, the Bosnian Serb entity in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but Euroscepticism as such does not have much appeal because these are societies that really want to join. They see their future in Europe. They see Europe as an opportunity economically, but also socially and politically. They're hoping for accountability from their governments, which they don't have at the moment. So all of these things are projected onto the EU. And so I wouldn't say that there's a fatigue on the side of the Western Balkan partners.
Now, you mentioned accountability, and we saw recently Serbia protests kind of blowing up. Do you think that this is going to inject some new form of momentum when it comes to Serbia's accession into the European Union?
It's very hard to predict what's happening. It's very clear that this is the toughest challenge really facing President Aleksandar Vučić in the almost 15 years that he's been in power. These are some of the largest demonstrations in Serbia since the overthrow of the Milosevic regime in the year 2000. So, you know, we see a momentum, political momentum, but also social momentum develop, whose implications, I think, are not quite clear yet. So Vučić might feel besieged and might feel that he needs to stir trouble, for example, in Kosovo, potentially, or create some kind of crisis that he can then help the Europeans manage. That's another technique that he's used in the past with quite successfully. I don't think that this is directly linked to EU accession as such. I mean, the students, the protesters are not necessarily all pro-European, pro-EU. Right. The EU has not really played a big role. There's been a level of disappointment even on the part of the protesters with the EU's very, very weak messaging about the protests. The EU institutions have not embraced these protests.
Right. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thanks so much.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.